Chapter 9. Adian, Stealing Stools. Adian's eyes fluttered open, but he immediately scrunched them back together in a futile effort to force himself back into slumber. If he was asleep, that meant he didn't have to get up. And if he didn't have to get up, then he didn't have to meet with Captain Rucker. And if he didn't have to meet with Captain Rucker, that meant he wouldn't commit murder today. So if he took into account that sleep equals less murder, murder is bad, and less bad is good, then that meant that him going back to sleep was an act of selfless virtue, right? Adian lay there with body tensed and eyes closed tightly as he tried to convince himself of the wisdom in his reasoning. Eventually, after it became quite apparent that he wasn't falling back asleep, he let out a long sigh and opened his eyes. He stared at the wooden boards of the ceiling as resignation slowly overcame his dread of the day ahead. Why? Why couldn't he just roll over and go back to sleep like a normal person? Why did he have to do mental gymnastics to try and convince himself to sleep? Sleep was the most natural thing in the world. It was supposed to be easy, wasn't it? It had to be years since he had slept in, because by the time he managed to convince himself of the value of more sleep, the mental strain of the persuasion inevitably woke him up completely. Adian slowly got up and began to get ready for the day. He might as well just get it over with, after all. If he was lucky, then the scouting mission would only take a few hours, and he would be able to spend his afternoon Rucker-free. He gave a small snort after he finished tucking in his shirt and whispered to himself, "Fat chance of that." Not long after that, Adian dragged his leaden feet down the steep stairway and into the desolate common room. He made his way to the far side and sat at a table in the corner. It was a strategic choice, as he was as far away as possible from the only other occupied table, where a middle-aged man sat in apparent contemplation as he nursed a steaming cup grasped between gnarled hands. Adian slightly perked up at the sight. A cup of hot tea wouldn't fix his situation, but it would go a long way to improving his mood. He looked around the room in an effort to catch sight of a barmaid, but had no luck. However, he did notice that there was a young man and an elderly fellow sitting with their backs to him at the bar. The sight struck him as odd since it was a bit early for alcohol, but then again, how much easier would it be to deal with Rucker if he had a few drinks in him? Adian grinned to himself ruefully, but shook his head. Drinking before a scouting mission would make him as irresponsible as Rucker. So he resigned himself to tea and sat back as he waited for the barmaid to appear. With nothing else to keep his attention, his eyes were drawn to the two men at the bar. The young man was tall, very tall. For a moment, Adian thought it might be Dre. This guy had to have him beat by a half foot. With his height and broad shoulders both taken into account, he was closer to a small giant than a large man. The half-giant stood up and gestured at an impractically large pack that was resting on the ground next to him, but still managed to reach almost as high as his head. He then picked up one of the bar stools and placed it into the pack. Adian frowned and glanced at the only other occupied table, but the man sitting there was still ruminating over his tea and didn't appear to have noticed. Adian stood up as another stool was placed in the bag. Was that guy just blatantly stealing stools? Then another stool entered the pack, and then another, and then two more. As he saw the stools disappear into the pack, his line of internal questioning shifted. How in the world were all of those stools fitting in there so easily? The young man then took the nearly full tankard from the elderly fellow, with no small amount of effort as the old man tried to fight him off. He opened a small, shallow pouch on the top front of his pack and proceeded to place the whole tankard inside, which was simply ridiculous because the pouch was obviously much too small to contain it. Adian felt his brow furrow even further as the young man picked up the bag and then started shaking it furiously. He even turned it completely upside down before he opened up the small pouch and removed the tankard, which, miraculously, appeared to still be nearly full. Adian couldn't make out the old man's verbal response to the absurdity of the situation, but he could see the wrinkled face mirroring his own complete and utter confusion. Adian stood up and walked towards the bar. He had caught a glimpse of the side of the young man's face as he had been placing things in the pack, and he could have sworn that it was, but that didn't make any sense. Dre? Adian questioned when he was only a pace or two away. Dre turned, and his already joyous expression became radiant. Adian, you're finally up. I was hoping to run into you. That's why I bribed old man Floyd to start his day drinking a little earlier than normal. Adian managed to hesitate for a heartbeat before he let the dam of his curiosity burst. I have so many questions. Where did you get the pack? Did you get taller? Why are you so happy today when you were depressed yesterday? I was worried that your class selection went poorly. But most importantly, why are you stealing stools? I would like to know about the stools myself, if you don't mind, Dre Taylor. If I don't get a reasonable answer, I will tell your mum and she will tan your hide. An indignant voice from behind him startled Adian, and he turned to see innkeeper Sorosa craning her neck up to look at Dre's now sheepish grin. Don't think that being so big will save you. I grew up with Delane, and know from experience that she is as strong as a whip. Adian smiled at the woman's antics, and laughed at the sight of Dre unconsciously rubbing his backside with unfocused eyes. His merriment was stilled when the innkeeper pinned him with a hard gaze that promised much more pain than a sore bum. Adian looked away from the woman and returned his attention to Dre. The young man shook his head, which seemed to snap him back to the present. Sorry, innkeeper Sorosa, he apologized, his tone that of a reprimanded child. He opened the bag next to him and, one by one, pulled out all 9 of the stools. Adian stared in wonder, and he had to physically restrain himself from running over and sticking his head inside of the bag in an attempt to figure out what was happening. Instead, he shifted his attention back to the innkeeper. He couldn't suppress a grin at the sight of her jaw practically dragging on the floor. After all the stools were returned, the woman's gaze flicked back and forth between Dre and the pack at least a dozen times. Her head belatedly followed the direction of her gaze, but in a way that made it seem like it was being pulled along behind her eyes. She opened her mouth to say something, but then snapped it shut. She repeated the action a few times, like a life-size nutcracker, before Dre, who appeared either unaware or unaffected by her amazement, said, It's Pac-Man Dre now, by the way. I chose my class, night before last. The woman smiled, gave a resigned sort of shrug, and turned her attention towards Adian. Can I get you some breakfast this morning, Bard? Adian sighed. We have discussed this at length. I'm a field musician and not a bard, but yes, please do. And some tea, if you please. Whatever you say, darling, she replied with a wink. What tea would you like? We just got in a shipment of magically enhanced tea from Telpaic. It's supposed to increase focus, among other things. I've yet to try it myself, but my merchant of over 15 years swears by the stuff. Adian shook his head. Just some regular old tea will work for me. If anything, I want to be less aware of what the rest of my day entails. The innkeeper smirked and gestured to the large mug grasped by Old Man Floyd. I have more than a few drinks for dulling the mind as well, if that is what you're after. Adian tried to smile at the woman's jest, but his lips felt like wax as he thought about his meeting with Rucker. Sorry, I shouldn't be so grumpy. I'm just not all that excited about the scouting mission this afternoon. Some tea along with some breakfast will be more than sufficient. Sorosa nodded, turned, and made her way back into the kitchen. This was followed by muffled shouting, of which Adian only caught the words lazy and ungrateful before he turned his attention away from the innkeeper's antics and back to Dre. He was surprised to find a nearly manic gleam in the boy's eyes. Scouting mission? Are you helping the militia take down the Ratgore? Can I come with you? I promise I'll be helpful. Adian raised a hand to stem the flood of questions pouring out of Dre. How about you answer the questions I already asked? Then maybe we can talk about that. Dre needed no more encouragement before he launched into a vague explanation of his class selection. Adian listened intently as he ate an expectedly bland breakfast, accompanied by a surprisingly pleasant cup of tea. From the sound of it, the poor man's class selection had been far more harrowing than anything that Adian could remember about his own, although, admittedly, his memories of it were kind of fuzzy. He couldn't help but think that it was all worth it, though, as his eyes were constantly pulled towards the mysteriously magical pack and the vast instrument-storing potential it held. Wait, what? Adian asked, his mouth half full of food, as a concerning comment from Dre pulled him out of his selfish daydreams. You were lit on fire? Dre nodded vigorously. For a moment, I thought I was going to die, but then I realized that even though the flames were hot, they weren't actually burning me. It felt more like a painful tingling. So is that when... Adian gestured to all of Dre. Dre laughed. Yep, I grew a few inches and gained some muscle. Plus, it unlocked the next set of skills. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to choose any of them. I guess I need to do some leveling up first. He shrugged. Which is why I need to join the scouting mission. Adian bobbed his head back and forth. Dre would be useful, that was for sure. The question was whether he trusted Rucker to keep his inexperienced companion out of danger. The answer was that he trusted in Rucker's leadership abilities about as much as he would trust in the ability of an undead crocodile to play the violin, but it was just scouting. How dangerous could it be? Maybe, Adian said to Dre, but first let's hear those potential skills of yours. It isn't often that people have such coherent memories about what happens in their sleep state. let alone have a class that allows choice. Dre nodded. Inventory, reduced weight, reduced size, increased capacity, and increased durability all branch out from Pac-Man Pack, while increased strength, increased constitution, treasure sense, quick retrieve, and encumbered balance all branch out from Pac-Man Physique. Adian nodded slowly as his mind raced through all of the possibilities. He was about to speak when Old Man Floyd, who had just finished his third mug of the morning, spoke for the first time since Adian had joined the conversation. "Seems simple enough. You get it, boy? You need me to explain it to you?" he asked in a gravelly voice weakened with age. Dre shook his head. "I don't think so. The general purpose of all the skills seems clear to me, unless either of you have any ideas on the specifics." Adian deferred to the old man, but he just shrugged and grabbed a mug handed to him by a passing barmaid. Adian couldn't stop himself from rolling his eyes before he returned his attention to an excited Dre. Specifics would be hard to guess. In most cases, skill names are created by the individual, if they are named at all, instead of being named by the class system. As such, in my experience, skill names and abilities vary wildly. I've seen one man's mighty slash get stuck halfway through a wooden shield, while another could cut through the trunk of a great oak. With that being said, though, I have seen some skills that could be similar to yours based solely on the names. "Really? What are they?" Dre asked, as he all but vibrated out of his seat. Adian glanced at the shadows cast by the stools, and then sighed. "Unfortunately, I have to get going. The militia will be expecting me." Before he even had a chance to stand up, Dre was out of his seat and by his side. "That's okay," he said. "You can just tell me about it on the way, right?" Adian pushed his plate and cup away from the edge of the counter, then stood up and sighed again. "I'm not in charge of the mission. Captain Rucker is, so you would need to get his permission before—" "That's fine. I'll ask him," Dre said quickly. Adian looked beseechingly towards the ceiling before responding. "It's not that simple. It could be dangerous, and you haven't even leveled yet." A panicked look entered Dre's eyes. "But I will be so helpful. I can carry all of your instruments. That would be way better than that clunky cart of yours. I would even carry some equipment for the militia if they want. I promise that I will do whatever it takes." "You aren't listening to me," Adian said as his gaze grew hard. "I said that it would be dangerous. This isn't some sort of game. We are scouting out an area that might well be the location of a new dungeon. You were already chased by Rakkor once. Do you really want to risk an encounter with him again, and so soon?" Hesitation flashed across Dre's expression before his resolve firmed. "I made it out alive last time. I can do it again. Besides, this time I have my class, and I'll be surrounded by high-leveled warriors, right?" Adian glared at the newly minted Pac-Man for a few heartbeats, but then chuckled. "High-leveled warriors is a bit of a stretch, at least for some of them. This is a militia, not a proper army, but I admit that most of them are competent and some are even talented. I would know. Up until a few months ago, I was a part of the Raven militia." He hesitated for a long moment, but the idea of having access to all of his instruments without having to lug the cart was just a little bit too tempting. "All right. You can ask Captain Rucker, but I have no idea how he will respond. The man is erratic at the best of times." A smile lit up Dre's face as a gleam flickered in his eyes. "You won't regret this. I swear it by all I hold dear, you won't regret it."